For most of human history, being short was simply a physical trait. But in the late 19th century, that changed in a dangerous way. Doctors, scientists, and governments in parts of Europe and North America began officially treating short stature not as a normal variation of the human body, but as a medical abnormality. In some cases, it was classified as a defect, in others, a disorder. And for many people, especially children, this label followed them for life. Before the 1700s, height had social meaning, but not medical weight. A short person might be teased, underestimated, or excluded from certain roles, but no physician would diagnose shortness as a condition needing treatment. That shift happened when modern science became obsessed with measurement. As medicine advanced, doctors began recording the human body in numbers: height, skull size, limb length, chest width, and facial angles. Once bodies were turned into data, they could be ranked. By the early 1800s, military and industrial records created massive height averages. Armies measured recruits, factories measured workers, schools measured children. These averages produced what scientists believed was the normal or ideal human build. Anyone who fell far below those numbers was increasingly seen as biologically behind. Medical journals of the time began describing short individuals as stunted, arrested in development, or degenerate in growth. This thinking was not accidental. It grew alongside social Darwinism, the belief that human beings could be ranked in value based on physical traits. Height became associated with strength, intelligence, leadership, and even morality. Short people were often described in medical literature as fragile, passive, and less capable of discipline. These ideas were not based on evidence. They were based on assumption dressed up as science. By the late 1800s, short stature had entered formal medical classifications. Doctors began using labels like pathological shortness, infantilism, and constitutional dwarfism, even for people who had no illness at all. Children who were simply smaller than average were now considered medically abnormal. Once a condition receives a name, it gains authority. And once authority appears, treatment soon follows. Hospitals and clinics began examining short children for supposed internal failures. The pituitary gland, thyroid, digestion, and bone formation were all blamed. Many of these children were perfectly healthy, but medicine at the time did not yet understand hormones or genetics. Instead of recognizing natural variation, doctors assumed malfunction. This belief turned shortness into something to be fixed. And when a society decides a body needs fixing, the next step is intervention. By the early 20th century, experimental growth treatments appeared. Some involved animal gland extracts. Others involved painful stretching devices designed to pull bones longer. Children were placed on extreme diets meant to force growth. None of these methods worked reliably, but the belief that shortness was a disease made these experiments socially acceptable. What made this period especially dangerous was that parents were encouraged to fear their own children's bodies. A short child was no longer just small. They were described as medically delayed, socially disadvantaged, and biologically limited. Families were warned that without treatment, their child would fail in life, struggle to marry, and be economically inferior. Short stature had officially crossed a line. It was no longer just a trait. It had become a diagnosis.
Once short stature was labeled a medical abnormality, childhood became the primary target. Doctors believed that if height could be controlled early, society could eliminate shortness altogether. This belief transformed children's bodies into long-term medical projects. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, schools, orphanages, and pediatric clinics across Europe and North America began treating growth as a race against time. One of the most powerful tools in this system was the growth chart. Today, growth charts are used to monitor health, but their early purpose was different. The first large-scale child growth charts were developed in the late 19th century, using data from military families, boarding schools, and industrial worker children. These charts created strict age-by-height expectations. A child who fell outside the normal range was marked as delayed, even if they showed no signs of illness. Once a child was flagged as below standard, intervention often followed. Doctors prescribed aggressive feeding schedules designed to force rapid weight and size gain. Children were made to consume heavy meat-based diets, raw eggs, milk concentrates, and early nutritional tonics. Many suffered digestive problems, vomiting, and nutrient overload. Still, their shortness was blamed on the child's body rather than the unnatural treatment. By the early 1900s, medical interest shifted to internal failures. The pituitary gland became a central suspect. Before endocrinology was fully understood, doctors believed the pituitary controlled growth directly and that underperformance caused short stature. Experimental hormone therapies soon followed. Children were injected with crude animal gland extracts taken from cattle, pigs, and sheep. These substances were not purified. Dosages were guesswork. Side effects included fever, swelling, organ stress, and in some cases, long-term endocrine damage. Another alarming practice involved physical manipulation. Orthopedic devices were created to mechanically stretch children's limbs. These devices applied sustained pressure to the legs over months or years. The belief was that bones could be trained to grow longer. Pain, joint damage, nerve compression, and permanent deformities were common outcomes. Yet parents were told this suffering was necessary to prevent their child from becoming a social failure. Short children were also psychologically reshaped. Medical reports from the early 20th century regularly described short patients as timid, passive, dependent, and emotionally immature. These traits were assumed to be natural consequences of their height rather than reactions to constant adult control and medical pressure. The child was treated as broken and eventually began to believe it. The school system reinforced this idea. Many short children were removed from regular physical education because they were labeled fragile. This reduced muscle development and stamina, which then falsely confirmed the original belief that they were physically inferior. A feedback loop formed. Medical restriction created weakness, and that weakness was used as proof of biological inferiority. What makes this period especially disturbing is that none of these children were sick in the traditional sense. They had no disease, no infection, no injury. Their only deviation was size. But once medicine declared that size itself was pathology, every aspect of their development became a problem to solve. By the early 1920s, short stature had become more than a diagnosis. It had become a life trajectory designed by medical authority, one that shaped education, nutrition, movement, opportunity, and identity from early childhood onward. And this system was only beginning.
By the early 20th century, the idea that short stature was a defect moved beyond hospitals and into government policy. What began as a medical opinion became part of a larger and far more dangerous ideology, eugenics. This movement, which spread across Europe and North America, claimed that human societies could be improved by controlling which traits were allowed to reproduce. Height quickly became one of the traits used to judge biological worth. Eugenics promoters believed that taller bodies represented strength, intelligence, leadership, and genetic superiority. Short bodies were increasingly framed as signs of weakness, poor heredity, and social burden. These beliefs were not fringe theories. They were taught in universities, published in major medical journals, and supported by government institutions. In the United States, height was included in physical fitness evaluations used in schools, immigration centers, and the military. At Ellis Island in the early 1900s, immigration officials measured arriving passengers for physical traits associated with supposed genetic inferiority. Extreme shortness could be recorded as a defect. While most short immigrants were still admitted, the label itself mattered. It was entered into medical records as a hereditary weakness. In parts of Europe, especially in Germany, Britain, and Scandinavia, anthropometric laboratories were established to measure populations. These facilities recorded height, skull size, arm span, posture, and facial structure. Short stature was increasingly grouped with developmental disorders, even when no disease existed. The body was no longer just a body. It was data in a national biological ranking system. The most extreme consequences appeared in Nazi Germany. The regime adopted eugenics as state doctrine. Physical traits were used to define human value. While short stature alone did not usually lead to extermination, it contributed to classifications of genetic unfitness. People who were small, physically atypical, or labeled developmentally delayed were targeted in compulsory sterilization programs under the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. Thousands were sterilized based on physical judgments that modern medicine recognizes as unscientific. Even outside Nazi influence, similar thinking existed. In Sweden, sterilization laws affected people labeled as physically or mentally inferior. Height, along with body proportions, was often cited as part of these assessments. The justification was always the same: to protect society from weakness by preventing certain bodies from reproducing. At the same time, the military reinforced these beliefs. Armies across the world set minimum height requirements for service. Short men were routinely rejected not because they lacked ability, but because they did not fit the ideal physical image of a soldier. This institutionalized the idea that taller bodies were more valuable to the nation. Workplaces did the same. Police forces, factory supervisors, and civil service departments often had height cutoffs. These standards were not grounded in job performance. They were rooted in public image and outdated biological assumptions. Short individuals were systematically excluded from authority and leadership. By this point, the notion that short stature was a defect had fully crossed from medicine into law, military policy, education, immigration, and employment. It was no longer just a doctor's opinion. It was a structural belief embedded in society. The end of World War II marked a turning point for many branches of science, including the study of human growth. The horrors linked to eugenics forced the world to question how physical traits had been misused as tools of judgment. For the first time, doctors began to seriously re-examine the assumption that short stature was inherently a disease. But undoing decades of institutional belief would prove far more difficult than changing a textbook. In the late 1940s and 1950s, endocrinology rapidly advanced. Scientists finally gained a clearer understanding of how hormones worked in the human body. Growth hormone, produced by the pituitary gland, was identified as only one of many factors that influenced height. Genetics, nutrition, childhood illness, prenatal development, and even environmental stress were proven to play significant roles. This directly contradicted the older belief that shortness always came from internal failure. Researchers also began tracking families across generations. They discovered that many healthy, fully functioning adults came from families in which short stature was common. There was no hidden disease, no degeneration, no developmental arrest, just inherited body type. This was one of the first major scientific blows to the idea that shortness itself was pathological. At the same time, long-term follow-up studies revealed the damage caused by earlier treatments. Children who had undergone early hormone injections often developed endocrine imbalances later in life. Those who had been placed in mechanical stretching devices showed higher rates of joint disorders, chronic pain, and spinal problems.
The very interventions meant to fix short bodies had produced permanent harm. Psychological research delivered another shock. Studies showed that many emotional and social difficulties once blamed on short stature were actually the result of stigma, medical labeling, and childhood institutionalization. When short children were treated no differently from their peers, those supposed personality flaws largely disappeared. This reversed a century of medical narrative that had blamed the body instead of the environment. Yet, despite these discoveries, the disease label did not vanish overnight. Medical classification systems still included terms like constitutional growth delay and idiopathic short stature. These categories acknowledged uncertainty but continued to frame shortness as a condition needing monitoring. Clinics that specialized in growth disorders expanded rather than disappeared. The target shifted from eliminating weakness to optimizing potential, but the pressure remained. Parents were still warned that being short could limit future income, romantic success, leadership ability, and self-confidence. Although no longer framed as biological failure, short stature was now described as a social disadvantage that medicine could help prevent. The language softened, but the message stayed powerful. Taller was still better. Pharmaceutical companies entered the picture in the 1960s and 70s as synthetic growth hormone became possible. What had once been experimental became regulated and standardized. For children with true hormone deficiency, this therapy was life-changing and medically necessary. But it also reopened an ethical door. Should healthy short children be medically altered simply to fit social expectations? By this stage, society stood in an uncomfortable middle ground. Science had proven that shortness was not inherently a disease, but medicine had already built an entire structure around correcting it. The belief was no longer rooted in survival or pathology. It was rooted in desirability. And that shift would reshape the next generation completely.
By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the story of short stature entered a new phase, commercialization. What had once been framed as a medical concern and later questioned by science was now being reshaped by the pharmaceutical industry into a treatable condition with enormous financial potential. This shift did not depend on proving that shortness was a disease. It depended on proving that parents would pay to prevent it. The development of synthetic human growth hormone was the turning point. Earlier versions had been extracted from human cadavers and were rare, risky, and limited in supply. But once recombinant DNA technology made large-scale production possible, growth hormone became widely available for the first time. Initially, it was approved strictly for children with clinical growth hormone deficiency, a genuine medical disorder that prevents normal growth. However, once mass production began, the definition of who needed treatment began to widen. Doctors now had a tool that could add inches to a child's height over several years. At the same time, decades of cultural conditioning had already linked height to confidence, leadership, attractiveness, success, and authority. Pharmaceutical companies did not need to invent this bias. It already existed. All they had to do was connect the fear of social disadvantage to a medical solution. In the 1990s, pressure grew to approve growth hormone for children who were simply very short but otherwise perfectly healthy. This group was classified under a new term, idiopathic short stature, meaning short height with no identifiable medical cause. In 2003, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved growth hormone for these children. This decision became one of the most controversial rulings in modern pediatric medicine. For the first time in history, millions of healthy children were now eligible for years of daily hormone injections, not to treat disease, but to alter a natural physical trait. The treatment was not minor. Growth hormone therapy requires injections every day for many years. Side effects could include joint pain, swelling, insulin resistance, and increased pressure in the brain. Long-term effects were still being studied. And yet, marketing framed the treatment as an opportunity rather than a risk. Parents were shown projections of future height gains, charts illustrated how a child could move from the bottom percentile to closer to average. Height was no longer presented as biology, it was presented as an upgrade. This created a powerful psychological shift. Parents who once accepted their child's size as nature began to feel they were denying their child a better future if they refused treatment. Some doctors resisted this framing. Others embraced it. Clinics specializing in growth optimization expanded globally, especially in wealthier countries where families could afford years of therapy. At the same time, social pressure intensified. Studies continued to show that taller individuals, especially men, were more likely to be promoted into leadership roles, earn higher incomes, and be perceived as more dominant. These statistics were often used to justify treatment, even though they reflected discrimination rather than biological necessity. By this stage, short stature was no longer officially a disease, but society was still treating it like a disadvantage that demanded correction. The language had shifted from defect to potential. The method had shifted from crude experiments to regulated pharmaceuticals. But the underlying pressure remained the same. The question had quietly changed from, "Is shortness a disease?" to something far more revealing. If we can change it, why shouldn't we?
By the late 20th century, medicine had largely abandoned the idea that short stature was a disease, but something else had already taken its place, a quiet, measurable bias that linked height to power, money, and authority. Even without a medical label, height continued to shape how people were judged in leadership, employment, politics, and relationships. The science had moved on, society had not. Large-scale economic studies in the United States and Europe began revealing a consistent pattern. On average, taller individuals earned more money over their lifetimes than shorter individuals, even when education, intelligence, and experience were the same. Some studies found that each additional inch of height was associated with thousands of dollars more in annual income. This gap was not explained by ability, it was driven by perception. Psychology helped explain why. Multiple experiments showed that people subconsciously associate height with dominance, confidence, and competence. In controlled settings, participants regularly rated taller individuals as more capable leaders, even when given identical information about performance. This bias appeared across cultures and age groups, indicating that it was learned early and reinforced constantly. Politics reflected the same pattern. In many democratic nations, taller candidates were statistically more likely to win elections, especially when voters knew little about policy positions. In the United States, the taller presidential candidate has won the popular vote in a majority of elections throughout modern history. Height had no connection to intelligence or leadership skill, yet it still influenced public perception. Dating culture amplified this pressure. Surveys consistently showed that height was one of the most strongly weighted physical preferences, particularly for men. Short men were more likely to be rejected before any personality traits were considered. For women, height bias expressed itself differently, but the message was similar. Deviation from physical ideals lowered perceived value. What made this phase especially significant was that the old medical stigma was no longer visible, but its social shadow was everywhere. Short people were no longer called defective, but they were still less likely to be promoted, chosen, trusted, or admired by default. The system had changed methods without changing outcomes. This is where the legacy of the shortness as disease era became undeniable. For over a century, institutions had trained the public to associate height with capability and shortness with limitation. Even after science disproved that idea, the ranking system remained active in the background. The military continued enforcing minimum height requirements in many countries, even when technological warfare reduced the need for physical size. Police departments, fire services, and security agencies often retained height cutoffs that had no clear connection to performance. These policies sent the same message in a modern form. Bigger bodies were still seen as more suitable for power. Entertainment reinforced it further. Leading roles in film, television, and advertising overwhelmingly favored taller figures, especially for characters meant to represent strength, authority, desirability, and success. Short characters were more often assigned comic, submissive, or non-threatening roles. These portrayals shaped how entire generations learned to associate height with status. By this point, short stature was no longer being attacked by medicine, but it was still being punished by culture. And this raised a deeper question that medicine alone could not answer. If science has proven that being short is not a disease, why does society still reward people as if it were?
By the early 21st century, the medical world had reached its conclusion. Short stature in healthy individuals is not a disease. It is a natural human variation shaped by genetics, nutrition, and environment. No modern medical authority classifies natural short height as an illness. And yet, something far more difficult to erase remains: the psychological and cultural inheritance of the old belief. Modern psychology has uncovered just how deep this bias runs. Studies on self-perception show that short individuals, especially boys who grew up under medical monitoring or social comparison, are more vulnerable to diminished confidence, chronic self-consciousness, and internalized inferiority. Not because their bodies limit them, but because they were taught that their bodies were a problem that needed correction. This internal conflict is one of the lasting consequences of the shortness as disease era. When a child is repeatedly measured, monitored, categorized, and compared, they do not experience their body as neutral. They experience it as a project that failed to meet expectations. Over time, this creates identity pressure, not from nature, but from systems that once claimed medical authority. Digital culture has intensified this pressure. Social media platforms amplify idealized body types at an unprecedented scale. Height is constantly emphasized in dating profiles, influencer culture, fashion, and entertainment. Algorithms reward what society already prefers. As a result, short individuals are once again pushed into visibility as less than, even without medical stigma. What makes this moment in history unique is that the original justification is completely gone. There is no medical diagnosis, no biological warning, no institutional classification. And yet, the same hierarchy operates quietly through economics, dating, leadership selection, and representation. This reveals a powerful truth. Medical myths do not disappear when science advances. They disappear only when culture releases them. The height story also exposes how easily society converts neutral traits into status markers. At no point in history was short stature proven to reduce intelligence, moral character, creativity, discipline, or leadership ability. But once power structures aligned height with dominance, every generation learned to read the body through that lens. Even today, when people instinctively assume authority from size, they're not responding to biology. They're responding to inherited conditioning. The most dangerous part of this history is not what medicine did, it is how rarely the world talks about what medicine once taught. There is no public reckoning, no formal apology, no global acknowledgement that millions of people were labeled biologically less for a trait that never harmed anyone. And without remembrance, the pattern risks repeating itself, with new traits, new technologies, and new justifications. Because history shows a consistent formula. First, difference becomes visible. Then difference becomes undesirable. Then medicine is called in to correct it, and finally society forgets that the judgment ever existed while still enforcing its consequences. Short stature escaped the disease label only because science caught up to assumption. But science alone does not erase social ranking. That requires cultural courage. Today, the question is no longer whether shortness is a disease. The real question is whether humanity is finally ready to stop treating natural variation as failure. If you had been born in a time when being short was officially classified as a medical defect, would you have accepted years of painful treatment just to fit society's standard? Or would you have rejected the label and lived with the consequences?